Hey there, improvement nerds. Welcome back to another episode where we nerd out on all things improvement. Today we have a very special guest, someone whose fingerprints are all over the way we think about visual management and collaborative work. Jim Benson is the co-creator of Personal Kanban, winner of the Shingo Prize, and co-founder of the Lean Coffee movement that many of us love in our communities today. His journey is anything but ordinary, from punk rock beginnings in Nebraska to urban planning and intelligent transportation systems to pioneering Kanban for knowledge work. All along the way, he's helped organizations around the world cut through noise, reduce toxicity, and focus on what really matters, how humans actually work together. In this conversation, Jim and I dig into the origins of Kanban, the power of limiting WIP, and why visualizing our work isn't just about efficiency, it's about fostering better conversations, relationships, and outcome. We also explore the story behind Lean Coffee and how a simple idea in a Seattle cafe became a global format for meaningful, agenda-free collaboration. So buckle up, nerds. This episode is packed with stories, insights, and practical wisdom to fuel our ongoing mission as we wage war on bad process. So today we are with Jim Benson. Jim, thank you for joining us on our podcast.
It is good to be here, Mark.
I have been eagerly awaiting this conversation, and we will see where today leads us and decide if today's conversation is enough for our audience or if we need to break this out into maybe a couple conversations based on our discovery call. I think we have a lot of meat on the bone here to discuss, but I want to start out just with, introducing yourself and maybe your background to our audience.
Okay. I'm Jim Benson. I helped launch the Kanban movement, author of Personal Kanban and creator of Personal Kanban, and winner of the Shingo Award for that with my co-author, Tony and DiMaria. I like to tell people that I got my start as an angry punk rocker in the 1970s and 80s in Nebraska. And that wasn't just screaming and yelling and jumping up and down, but it was learning how to play instruments, press albums, build a distribution network globally, and sell things back when there wasn't an internet, right? So we, from Grand Island, Nebraska, literally had a global distribution for both people and AMA records, which we sent out all over the place. And after doing that, I went into urban planning, built giant things like freeways and subways around the world. While doing that, I was the guy who knew something about tech all the time. So I became involved in the beginnings of what's called the intelligent transportation systems, helped build the first real-time traffic website and then the first GIS-based real-time traffic website. So if you've ever used Google Maps and things like that, which I'm sure you have, that's been part of what I touched. While we were doing those initial projects, we became aware of a guy named Kent Beck. Kent Beck helped us become agile. But right off the bat, the 2-week for him iterations for Scrum, that type of iterative development actually ended up not being fast enough for us. So Kanban kind of came out of that, where we needed to adapt to change faster than Agile could. That started, unfortunately for us, the long Kanban Scrum wars, which I never asked for, but somehow got caught in the middle of. And today I have a company called Modus Institute where we teach people about visual management in general. Kanban is part of that, and the reduction of essentially toxicity. So for most teams, you might have some functional bottlenecks, but your biggest bottlenecks are just how you share information, make decisions, and relate to each other. And Tony and I do that also through our consulting practice. Oh, I also created Lean Coffee in there somewhere.
That's a lot. And there's so much to unpack there. And maybe we'll get into the records, pressing and distribution later, as that's a big topic right now. So
yeah, there's very few vinyl pressing plants left anymore.
One of the major ones burned down. Vinyl so has a huge resurgence. So that's interesting. You talked about just starting the Kanban movement casually. I'm just so curious about the touch points with Agile. Had you had exposure to continuous improvement before? Did that come through Agile and then into continuous improvement?
That's an awesome question. And so my first touch with continuous improvement actually came during my short stay at the University of Nebraska through a class called Community Futures, which was also my entry into urban planning. And as a freshman, I talked my way into a graduate level course. And in the course, there's like the best thing ever. In this course, one of the things that we did is we watched like Blade Runner and about the role of urban form in Blade Runner. And part of this was we studied stuff by a guy named Robert Theobald, who was a futurist. And he talked about Deming. And then that was my first touch with continuous improvement at all, was actually just then, and when the books were still pretty new, getting into Deming's work. Then when I was an urban planner, one of the senior managers at David Evans and Associates, the company I was working at, he read Machine That Changed the World. We ran a bunch of workshops on that. And then I went into Agile. Then I came back into Lean. So Tony and I are both senior faculty at the Lean Enterprise Institute now. So it was a very windy road to get to where I am, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. So the exposure you had and then getting into Agile and then seeing maybe Kanban principles again emerge from that. And then you took that to create or co-create the personal Kanban, and you wrote a book about that. Can you talk a little bit more about personal Kanban?
Yeah. So I'll first talk a little bit about Kanban and how that came about. So Dave Anderson and I used to go weekly to Milady's pub just down the street from my house and bemoan our fates and also talk about his book, Agile Management, which was a very difficult book to implement, but had a lot of good ideas in it. And so as we talked about those things, we started talking about, the power of this comes from when you're able to actually see what's going on. And during this conversation we were having that night, we were both having problems with teams we were working with, doing the Agile thing of saying, this is what I did yesterday, this is what I have to do today. I don't have blockers, but no one ever said if they ever finished anything. So I had asked my teams, are you actually finishing anything? And they're like, shut up. And so Dave and I, on the back of a napkin in Milady's, wrote the first Kanban. He went off and kind of did it Microsoft in a Kanban method style. I went off to my company at Gray Hill Solutions and started doing it as kind of a more personal Kanban style. And personal doesn't mean for an individual, it means of value to people. So we want the things that are flowing through the Kanban to ultimately be of value to the people doing the work. And so Tony Ann and I started working together on a different book that I was writing a long time ago. And I ended up getting a project with the intelligence community in Washington, D.C. And so I moved to Washington, D.C., where she was. She and I started working together. And as we started working together, we started to discuss how we were working with the Kanban. And we realized we needed to write the personal Kanban book. And that's the very short form of how that book came about.
So interesting. For those that are listening that are not familiar with Kanban, maybe they've never heard the word before. Can you walk us through what is a Kanban in this context, as how we look at our work or things that we do, how we create pull for different work items that we need to do? And if you can, then we'll talk on limiting WIP after that.
Sure. So some people may be familiar with the more Toyota version of Kanban, which is a card that limits work in progress by creating a certain number of cards that flow through an assembly line. And the Kanban that we're talking about here for knowledge work is a board, either online or in real life. If you've ever used Trello or Asana or any of those types of things, that is a Kanban as we know it. And based on the ideas that I came up with that night, the goal here is for people to be able to visualize independently and together the work that is planned, the work that is currently in process, and the work that has been completed, and then ultimately receive from those visualizations several ongoing triggers. What should I pull next? What does the market want me to pull next? What work has been adequately described such that it's able to pull? What work requires us to collaborate? Then you pull that work, you move that work into an active state, which can have any number of columns. So like with Turner Construction, their procurement process had 27 columns between not ready and complete. But those are the states that it travels through in order to ultimately produce value, and places where it might get stuck or touches different people, whatever causes that state to need to be visualized. The items that are flowing through there usually belong to one or more people. One of the things that we try and push, if you will, with a Kanban is that we want people to collaborate more. So we try and get our Kanban tickets that are flowing through the system to have express rules behind them about when you need to work with other people and talk to other people. We find that in knowledge work, especially, most work that fails because of communication problems or lack of information, not because of lack of ability or time or really anything else, but it's more just the interactions of people not being what it should be to complete it. Then when the work is done, you have your done state, and your done state, a lot of people will move that in and think I'm done. Therefore, I don't need to think about it anymore. But that's where your CI, your continuous improvement, actually starts. So it's usually helpful in there to have some indicators of this went well, this didn't go well, I liked doing this, I hated doing this, whatever metrics work for your team, but things that will trigger a conversation afterwards so that you're not engaged in the dysfunction of waiting for a retrospective or a Kaizen event to engage in continuous improvement and cause it to be continuous. So when it's going to move into a state and it requires a conversation because it didn't go well, that either needs to be batched with other things to make a group and then talk about them then, or it needs to be talked about immediately.
Yeah, that's a great point. In places that I've worked in the past and implemented some type of Kanban board, you get to a column that is generally labeled done. And that has never really sat well with me. Just kind of move that work off the board or place it in a stack, place it in the filing cabinet. So what I've done is change the word to control. That's one of the variations I've used is control. Like in this section, we need to think about how are we going to build control plans? How are we going to keep it this way? How do we make sure it doesn't regress? But as I hear you speak, I think a better word might even be learn or something like that. What did we learn from this? And then figure out how we're going to control that. So,
you could just actually label you have your readies, you have your inaction, things that are currently being acted on, and then you have the things that have reached that state where the action is complete. And so if we actually just put up at the top above all of those columns, plan, do, study, and then at some point somebody needs to adjust. So the adjust ends up being an action. So when they're in the study column, they're waiting to be studied. And then when you're adjusting them is when you're actively taking them, looking at them, and creating new items for the next round of work.
yeah, it's so exciting. And if there is anyone that has been listening that is unfamiliar with Kanban, but maybe familiar with Trello or Monday or Airtable, and they have that Kanban view. I mean, if you click on that, you're going to see exactly what we're talking about here. Sometimes generally columns, 3 columns labeled to do, doing, done, something like that, where you can take your work and move it through the board. One of the important concepts is to limit the width. As I created boards in the past, sometimes it'd just be physical, big dry erase boards that I stripe out and put some transparencies in and shift the work. But what I try to do is not only have columns, but have rows so that, maybe I have 4 or 5 spots in the work that I'm doing. So I don't overload. I don't have excess width, things I need to do or that the team needs to do. Can you talk a little bit about a few things, maybe why we limit width and what happens in our brain as we move stuff out of width to a more finalized state?
So this used to be a very simple delivery for me, and I've complicated it. So I will give the simple answer first, and then I will let people know the kind of gotcha here. When we have a lot of things that we're engaged in simultaneously, we have a lot of work in process. Our brains are constantly thinking about that work in process. So that means that everything that you have that is currently in an active state that you've started, but you haven't finished, you are thinking about the state that it's in, who you're working with, who it's for, how long you have to complete it, when people are going to start to get annoyed, what the value date is of that. So every option has a value date, a strike date, where you need to start it by a certain time and you need to finish it by a certain time in order for the value to be achieved from that option, which is why in our Kanbans, we tend to say options doing and done, not ready doing and done, because we want to make it clear that those are options and they have option value. But when those are all active, your brain is thinking about all that stuff. And then that means that your cognitive load is high, or it is higher as you have more things in flight. So you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to start forgetting stuff. Well, three things. You're going to start forgetting stuff, or you're going to start working very slowly, or both. So we want to limit our work in progress so that we, as the human elements that are doing the work, aren't overloaded, and then the work is completed. So we want people to be able to focus and finish with quality, as opposed to be overloaded, finish without quality, and have all of the rework and conversations and extra meetings and stuff that go along with that.
I really appreciate not only the mechanics of the Kanban and how do you maneuver through, how we pull work, how we limit WIP, but the thought that you have around the human side of what is happening with the people doing the work and how they're processing it and how you present personal Kanban or Kanban in a way that is human focused.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate the thought pattern there, and we don't want to overwhelm the people doing the work or underwhelm them, but we want to have just the right size, the best that we can do and manage through that in workable chunks.
If you don't have a WIP limit, you can never have.
Right.
So all rivers have banks, and banks are WIP limits. And then if you have too much water, then you have a flood. So you either have flow or you have flood. And most teams are operating constantly in a flood zone. They lose pretty close to half of their productive capacity due to just cognitively switching back and forth between these tasks. And when we say that, it sounds like we're saying like, you're going to like physically say, I'm going to work on this task a little bit, then I'm going to work on this task a little bit. No, you don't have a choice. When you start a task, you start a relationship with another human being, and then that other human being is going to show up on Teams or in Slack or on your phone or at your desk or, dangling outside your window from a helicopter. And they're going to be saying like, are you done yet? Are you done yet? Where's this at? Do you need this? Can I have this? What'd you decide here? And so every time you start a task, you start a social relationship that creates multiple cognitive switching penalties. So I personally believe that all of the studies that I've read about people, switching, they look for like the cognitive recovery time from moving from task A to task B. What they're rarely looking at is the amount of conversations that people are having that they never needed to have because the group as a whole has too much WIP. And the group as a whole often has too much WIP because everybody's given their own stupid tasks to go off and do slowly and alone and in a way that doesn't inform anybody else, rather than people pairing or mobbing on things in ways that would allow people to make decisions together, build it better, and build it faster.
Yeah, I love that. Two of the basic phases of lean is to create flow and establish pull. And this is really a tool or exercise to help lean practitioners do that, or anyone is involved with work, manage their work better and more effectively.
Yes.
So I guess let's talk about lean coffee. That's how you and I have come to know each other a little bit. I was first exposed to lean coffee. Someone in my area invited me to a lean coffee. I went to it not really knowing what it was. And it was really just 4 people in a coffee shop talking about lean. So I don't personally drink coffee, but I enjoy talking about lean. So I was hooked on that. And, it was just 4 people. And the person that was in charge of it or kind of leading it had a great opportunity to go somewhere else. And myself and someone else was gifted the opportunity to lead that. And was here. And we continued to talk about lean and have coffee. And it grew. So we decided, you know what, let's, now that we have 10 or so people, look at our workplaces. We went to the Gemba, if you will, and looked at how people were implementing lean in their workplaces, and then went into this agendaless conversation where we talked about lean in the lean coffee structure. That grew to where we couldn't visit people anymore at their place of work because it's too many people. So we then had people start to present what they're doing. I think it's a great structure, and I can tell that it is because of the growth that we've seen. So here in Indianapolis, we have one per quarter now, a lean coffee, and we have a presenter come in and talk for about 20 minutes on a topic. Hopefully that gets people's juices flowing, but then we have breakout groups where we put people in about 4 to 5 and have the columns outlined and people place what they want to talk about on the board, and they do some multi-voting and they have time discussion. And I think it's just a real good time. But I would just like to understand from your perspective how that structure came about. What was your vision, if you had one, for Lean Coffee, or did it just grow organically?
Yeah.
Let us know.
So years ago, my friend Jeremy Lightsmith and I were having coffee in a coffee shop just down the street from my house here. And he said, there's a lot of people in Seattle who are doing personal Kanban and Kanban. We should start a professional organization. And laziness is kind of the mother of invention. So I was like, that just sounds like a lot of work to me. I would much rather that we get a bunch of people together in a coffee shop and we just talk about this stuff. Like a meetup? I was like, no, because meetups have no structure, therefore they have no product. We want these to actually be directed and guided and have a product. So I said, why don't we set up a personal Kanban on the table, and people will put in topics in, and then we'll vote on those topics, and then people will talk about them in the order voted. And then as we're talking about them, when people see things that move them or they've learned from or they think are interesting, they can write those down, and then we can have kind of this constant recording of what's happening in the meeting. And he's like, that's amazing. That's brilliant. Let's do it. So a couple of weeks later, we did the first one. We did it in South Lake Union in Seattle. A couple dozen people showed up and it was wonderful. So we wrote some blog posts about it. And the next thing I knew, they were happening all over the world. Like it caught on like wildfire, and it caught on like wildfire because the instruction set is set up such that if you ever experience it, you're instantly an expert. So you don't have to go to classes to learn how to do Lean Coffee. Is put tickets down, talk about them, write what you talked about. But the beauty of it is that it actually does have a profound impact on the people who come to the meeting, because it respects the perspectives, the brains, the ideas, needs of the people who show up. So it is literally a pull system of ideas by the people who show up. So if you're in a company and you have one of these around a topic, like we want to solve this problem, we did this at Riot Games a lot. People would show up, we say, we have this problem, and then they would show up and you just talk about it amongst peers, and the tickets end up being most of the things that either could be root causes or things that would trip you up or major bottlenecks or issues. And then those lead to deeper conversations. And then the next thing you know, you're on your way to actually solving a real problem, rather than saying we're going to get together and have this meeting and present things, or they fight about what's to talk about. The story that I have about the day I realized that this was something special was Tony Ann and I were working with a company that was extremely regimented, and the power distance was just absolutely vicious. Just people at certain power levels could not talk to people at other power levels. And that even went from like top down, like upper management people could not talk to line people. They had to go through the chain. So we did some Lean Coffees, and by the third one, everybody was showing up. And when they got there, they put in tickets. So in one of them, one of the line worker guys who never could have talked to senior vice presidents puts this ticket in, and all of the SVPs vote for that ticket. And then they talk about it. And so then when they're talking about it, then they're talking about it as peers. They're talking about it with respect. And so now all of a sudden, that line worker guy and the SVPs are now more human to both. And it wasn't contrived. It wasn't condescending. It was just a conversation. And that made me realize, first of all, like, wow, this thing I created is like super humbling. Like, I built this thing and it actually works. That's pretty crazy. But the other thing that I realized is that whether it's with a Kanban or an Obeya or anything else, that's what our visualizations are doing. Is our visualizations as a whole, they're not there to solve a problem. They're not there to track your work. They're there to foster the right conversations and the right information and the right relationships at the right time to do quality work. And that to me is so moving. And it's literally why I get out of bed in the morning, is because that relationship there solves so much toxicity in any workplace. So that power distance, totally toxic. All it took to break it down was a Lean Coffee.
I've seen that firsthand. I guess it's got to be inspiring to think that, hey, this is just something that you guys did in Seattle, and it went globally pretty quick. So that's an indicator that, you're on the right track there with something. I know that my personal experience with Lean Coffee and maneuvering through conversations with that structure helped me, I believe, be a better leader. we would have meetings at work, and generally I would formulate an agenda of things that I would want to talk about as the leader. And because, I was the leader, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to tick those off. I'll say my piece and we're dismissed.
And then what happens on the other side
Yeah.
is I get your agenda and I'm like, oh, Mark thinks we're going to talk about this, bastard. I have my own agenda and I'm going to bring that. Psychologists call that reactance. And so reactance is that when you give something to somebody to do, the first thing that they say is like, do I have to? And then the second thing they say is, how can I placate Mark by playing along with him? And then the third thing they say is, how can I ignore Mark? So the moment anyone sends out a strong agenda, they create a large number of other agendas that are contrary to what we want to achieve. So that initial combative stance, which feels helpful, I'm setting up this agenda so everybody knows what they're going to get out of the meeting, actually ends up creating more friction than it does flow.
And you can feel it.
Yeah.
I decided to break away from that pattern and implement basically the Kanban, the lean coffee style, into meetings. So I like the flexibility of this and the different ways that you can use it. For me, when I used it in meetings, I did have things that I'd want to talk about, but what we did was put out Post-it notes and said, hey, what do you want to talk about as a group? And I would say 9 times out of 10, what I would have already on my list, my agenda to talk about, was placed up by someone else.
And therefore owned by that someone else.
Yes, absolutely. So it brought peace to my heart when I would see them put it up there as the people leader, and they would vote on it. We would discuss it, and it didn't come from me. So no one had to ignore Mark in that situation. They felt like they owned it, to your point. And because we had some time limits around the discussion and we were doing some silent voting, thumbs up, thumbs down, we got through more agenda items than like meetings in the same corporation. So it's a way to get through more and to have really deep. What I've seen also is in another organization I was in, there would always be this one person that would take control of a meeting and talk the whole time and force their, like to your point, force their agenda. People began to resent the meeting itself because of the person and how they showed up and presented. And when we switched to this, it was a little bit difficult, but we did. And that person that would usually just kind of go on and about his thing, one, if that wasn't voted for, it wasn't talked about.
Yep.
Two, it was a time discussion. So he might have a very long preamble, but when the time went up, it was over. So we learned to curtail how he was going to get his point across in a more succinct way, right? Like that's kind of what A3 is about, right? How do we put all of our information on one side of one sheet of paper, tell a story? This format is how do we have a meaningful discussion in a certain amount of time and get through these items that are chosen by the people and participants within the group. So I love the format. I've taken it from Lean Coffee to other things. And I'm sure you've probably heard stories where people are using, I've had people that I showed this to, and they've used it for their kids' chores at home because it's such an easy tool. Is there any stories like that that you have that stick out to you?
There are. I do want to cover the first thing just to like make this point very clear is that so you mentioned that you start talking and then you set a timer for however much time you want. Well, I usually use 10 minutes. Some people do 8, some people do whatever. And then at the end of that time, people vote that they want to continue, that they don't care, or that they want to stop. And the reason for this, and part of the reason why that guy talked too much, is because that guy didn't understand the right amount of talk. And there was no beneficial constraint to stop that talking. So when people start talking, there's no rule that says they have to shut up, so they don't. They suffer from this more than anybody. And so the beauty of Lean Coffee is it actually provides a mechanism for people to shut up without the room saying, dude, would you just shut up? Which tends to be combative and toxic, right? So really interesting Lean Coffee stories that I have. I'll keep going back to Riot Games for one, and it doesn't involve families or kids, unfortunately, but this one involves intractability. So when Riot first started, it was a couple of guys in a basement. They were coding maniacally, and then they would release in real time, and then they were on IRC with their users. So they were sitting there literally text chatting with their users as they were releasing things. Then you fast forward to when we were working with them, and they had 4 million unique users a month, and people located in 3 countries. And so it's unlikely that you're going to have that type of real-time access, but the users missed it, and they missed it. Even the people at Riot that had never experienced it missed it. And so we had a session where we basically said, we have this sticky problem that has now become kind of like this cultural point where we just mope about it. What would we do to actually solve this problem? And we ran through a series of lean coffees in a thing that Tony and I call a Kaizen camp, where you set up a bunch of lean coffees, people report out, then you put up tickets for other lean coffees, and then they do those, and then they report out. And as they go through them, they reify the ideas. And actually, Mark, you and I have been talking about doing one of those in Indianapolis. But when we did that, the number of not just ideas, but the ability to refine those ideas quickly was so, I don't want to use the word empowering, I'm going to say enlivening to the people who were working at the company, that they then took those ideas, formed groups, and then figured out how to create systems that would allow them to recreate that level of customer touch in a world where they didn't have it. So it involved a bunch of people who had accepted a bad situation and allowed them to think their own way out of it into a good situation just by talking to each other, literally just by coming up with ideas in a non-threatening way. When we talk about kids, trying to blind item this, we worked with an organization somewhere that worked directly with children who were homeless, came from abused backgrounds, and were a danger for substance abuse issues. And this group took these kids and put them into places where they had housing and where they were less likely to use, and then got them into things like community college and stuff, or to get their GED. It was a super awesome program. And what they found was that when the kids had a one-on-one relationship with a counselor, that would develop like a dependency on the counselor or an adversarial relationship with the counselor, and sometimes it would work. But they wanted to get away from the first two. And usually when they did group sessions, it was kind of in that traditional, we're all in a circle and we're doing stuff. And so at one point we said, why don't we try lean coffee with this? And the first thing is that they like coffee because it's one of the things that isn't a drug. So they were like, that works. And so the next thing was just that it allowed the kids to put in tickets, talk about things that were really bothering them, that the other kids could watch how they expressed it and then evaluate it, relate to it, and do it in a way that was nonverbal. And that nonverbal part of lean coffee is this kind of strange equalizer, that the printed word is less threatening than the spoken word. You're less likely to call a sticky note an idiot than you would like some other kid. And it was really, I wish there was a way for me to just do stuff like that 24/7.
Wow, it's so impactful. And it's just, people might wonder why sometimes lean zealots like us get so excited about these systems and structures that support great work to help deliver great outcomes. But I hear the passion in your voice, and I know personally I'm passionate about all this stuff. And our listeners, I would say, as well. So we're speaking to a good group who really, really care about this stuff. And I feel like with you, I can go on and on for hours. Maybe we'll put a pin in it on this episode.
Okay. I think you could chop this episode into 2 episodes by now.
Yeah, I think we need to do another one and just keep peeling back the onion and just keep going further. So I hope our listeners will stay tuned for our next episode. If we can have Jim Benson back on, we will, and talk with him even further and nerd out. So, man, I just feel really impacted by the work that you've done.
Thank you.
And I can say the community here in Indianapolis, has been impacted through the Lean Coffees. If it wasn't for Lean Coffee, I would not be on the Improvement Nerd podcast right now, because that's how I met my business partner, was through this networking event. So thank you for coming on, and we'll send you back on.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of the Improvement Nerd Podcast. Huge thanks to Jim Benson for joining us and sharing his journey from punk rock to personal Kanban to Lean Coffee, and for reminding us that improvement isn't just about tools. It's about people and the conversations that bring work to life. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a chance to nerd out with us. Share it with a colleague, drop us a review, and let us know what resonated with you most. Until next time, keep improving, keep connecting, and remember, always leave your processes better than you found them.